My name is Amy Julian, and I'm the director for the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. We are excited to bring to you an ADA webinar today on quality indicators of programs serving students with ASD. Our presenter today is Nikki Michalak, and she is not only our presenter, she's a dear friend and colleague, and we're so excited to have her with us today. She is the statewide director for the Autism Professional Learning and Universal Support Project here at Illinois State University. This project is a sister project to the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, which creates resources and provides professional developments that assist individuals with autism spectrum disorder in their transition from secondary education to post-secondary education and employment. So we are excited to have Nikki with us today. A couple of housekeeping items as we do get started. Those of you who are attendees, you have the chat function where you can post your questions or contribute in any way. I know Nikki's going to have some questions for you. In addition, you should be able to raise your hand if you know your microphone is working and capable and doing well. If you do want to ask questions at the end, we will be willing to unmute individuals, but you can post your questions there in the question pane. When you do turn on your chat, there is sometimes an option to go to everyone or host and panelists. Be sure you're going to everyone so everyone can see those chat questions there. And then as we move along, we will also be having closed captioning is turned on. So if you are able to turn that on for yourself, it should have already been on when you started. So we have full accessibility for our patrons. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Nikki, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you are doing well and staying warm. It is chilly here in Central Illinois. And as Amy said, this is a collaboration between the ADA project and then the Autism Professional Learning and Universal Supports project. And we are a newer project within our state. We were funded primarily to help support teachers who are working with students who have intense, severe behaviors. So we were funded around the time that the Chicago Trib released the articles in conjunction with ProPublica on the wrongful use of timeout and restraint in our state. So we support districts who have students who have intense behaviors. We go in and help problem solve and put in place antecedent-based interventions in hopes to reduce the amount of time students are spending in timeout and in restraint. So that's a little bit about our project. Today, we're going to talk about what are some of the quality indicators for programs that are effective for students with autism. So the project that we're working on right now really focuses on decreasing and changing teacher practice for timeout and restraint. But that's almost like a quick fix. We know that there are qualities of programs that we can put in place that are preventative, that are proactive. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to highlight what some of those areas are and dive into what they might look like so that you can identify if you have these structures in place within your own classroom or within your own district. So back in December, I don't know if anybody of you are aware of this, but in December, we had a prevalence increase in autism. In the chat box, does anybody know what the current rate of autism is, the current prevalence rate? And it was a recent update. Yes, you guys are good. The most recent update that the CDC released was 1 in 44, and that was released back in the beginning of December. 4 times more prevalent in boys than girls. So we know that there is a crazy increase, right, in the increase in prevalence for students who are being diagnosed with autism. Specifically in our state, this is the data that is for students who are receiving services underneath that eligibility criteria of autism. And so this graph really shows the increase, and it's a beautiful increase, isn't it? Which is unfortunate, of students receiving services underneath that autism category for like the past 23, 24 years. And so currently there are 28,761 students. Now, if you take a look at this number, 1 in 44, and you take a look at, we have 28,000. We know that if we would use the 1 in 44, we would probably expect to see over 60,000 students receiving services for autism. However, we know that some students don't have an educational impact, therefore they may not need or receive services for autism underneath that eligibility. Some students might receive services in other disability categories. For instance, they may receive services under OHI or speech language. So autism may not be their primary, so therefore they may receive services underneath a different disability category. What we do know is that we truly are seeing an increase in these numbers, because if we were just re-diagnosing and doing a better job with diagnosis, we would start to see some of these other disability categories like cognitive impairment or speech language or other health impairment decrease. But as we're seeing autism increase, those other disability categories are staying, they're plateauing, they're leveling. So it's not like we're just re-diagnosing, because if we were, we would start to see those disability categories decrease. So we are seeing a true increase across the United States. We're seeing a parallel increase in the numbers of students who are receiving services and enrolled in special education programs. It's actually a 350% increase between 2004 and 2014, of course, according to OSEP. So it is increasing at alarming rates. And so because of that, we know that there is a definite need that we have to provide appropriate and high quality educational programs for students who have autism. And in fact, over the past probably 20 years, we've seen an increase in parents who have brought legal actions against school systems for not providing quality programs for students who have autism. Unfortunately, when school systems lose these lawsuits, oftentimes it's in part because they're not able to document the quality of services that they have been providing. So sometimes these supports are in place, sometimes they're not. So we know that IDEA really specifies for students with disabilities that you have to provide a free and appropriate educational services in the least restrictive environment. And in addition to that, the law also provides very specific details about these requirements, meaning that each student will have to have an IEP, that there is a transition plan when a student turns 16. And then it also identifies different environmental factors. And when we talk about the environment really refers to the physical, the instructional, and the social features of a classroom or other instructional areas or non-instructional areas of the school setting. And so what we really want to do is we really want to take a look at what are some of these quality indicators of these programs that have been shown to be successful for students with autism. And probably over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of research focused on what are the quality indicators, and many scales have been developed. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at, I'm not going to share a specific scale, there's lots of them out there, but I'm going to highlight commonalities that are identified as quality indicators for programs that support students on the spectrum. So next slide. So when we take a look at program quality, what we want to really think about is the framework or the foundation. And so these might be considered the contextual features of a program that represent best practices. And the program quality is really that foundation, or it's the house in which evidence-based practices would be implemented. So when we take a look at evidence-based practices, those are more of like the furniture or the different appliances that are designed to meet different functions. So those would be considered our evidence-based practices. And so they are specific tools for specific skills. So I want to throw it out to you guys. I'm going to have to hop out really quick. The question is, and I have a Jamboard, so I'm going to open that up. What are the elements of high quality educational programs for students with autism? So I'm going to, 1 second, hop out of here. Oh, minimize that. And I'm going to open up the Jamboard. Actually, I'm going to put the Jamboard in chat. Okay, see if you guys can open that up. Does that work for people? Let me know in the chat. I'm going to pull it up on here so you can see it as well. Beautiful. All right. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jamboard or not. There should be a menu on the left side of your screen, and you can go in, and the easiest one to use is a sticky note, I think. So you can take a sticky note and then it pops up on your screen and you can type. So type in, what are some of the elements of a high quality educational program for students with autism that you are familiar with? And as you share them, they should pop up. Support. All right, now can you see my screen? Can you see the Jamboard? Beautiful. All right, I'll give you a few minutes to add those in. And sometimes they pile on top of each other so I can move them. Whoever listed support, what kind of support are you talking about? There's lots of different types of support that are important. All right, we'll give it another minute. Teacher and parent support. Absolutely. So I think a lot of what you guys are identifying are definitely things that we're going to talk about. Routines and visuals, teacher and parent support, FBA and BIPs, that functional approach to looking at behavior, or understanding why a behavior occurs. Funding is incredibly important. Staff training, absolutely. Social stories and social narratives, those are different evidence-based practices that are effective for students with autism. Defined areas of the room, so organization, visual schedules, staffing, behavior systems, all very important aspects. Communication support. Tell me a little bit more about that. What type of communication support? Are you talking about communication for your students or systems for your students? Or are you talking about communication amongst team members or communication with families? Sure. So an FBA, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when I get down to talking about some behavior components. An FBA is a functional behavior assessment, and that's a process that we use to identify the function or the reason a behavior is occurring. And a behavior intervention plan is what we put in place when we have identified the function to teach an alternative or a replacement behavior so that the student can use an appropriate replacement instead of the challenging behavior that they might be using. Beautiful. All right. People have stopped responding. So these are all great ideas. I'm going to pause my screen really quick and figure out where my PowerPoint presentation is and get that back up. All right, I think I have it. All right, can you see it? Did I do it? Should see facilitate program change. Does everybody see that? Beautiful. All right. And so we know that there's a lot of really good things happening out there. And there's also areas that we can target to improve. And so a lot of the research has pointed to different quality indicators. And on this next slide, this is an overview of what these quality indicators are. And so these are components of the APERS. The APERS is the Autism Programmatic Environmental Rating Scale. And it is an assessment that our team was trained on. It is developed out of the University of North Carolina. And you have to have specific training to be able to implement it. But I'm happy after this session, I will share my email and I'm happy to problem solve and talk about different ways that this assessment can get out to different districts. And it is a very comprehensive assessment. And it has 3 components. It has a direct observation. So you go into a classroom and you observe for a 3-hour time period. It has a records review. So you take a look at a couple of IEPs prior going into that observation, and you really look to see the different supports that are identified within the IEP. And you look for those within the classroom environment or any area of the school in which the student interacts. And then the other component of it is an interview. So you interview different staff and you ask different questions that align with these different domains to really get a good picture of what supports are in place in each of these areas. So there are 10 different domains that have been identified that really impact program quality. And we're going to dive into those in just a minute. But what we find is that when these different 10 aspects of these different 10 domains are in place, that improves the quality of the program, which allows you then to have success implementing the evidence-based practices. Are you all familiar with evidence-based practices for students with autism spectrum disorder? I would say probably over the last 15 years, we started off with looking at different strategies that were evident, that had evidence supporting their use, that had some support for their use, and then identifying different practices that were not recommended. And so there are 2 different projects that really have dove into the research to identify what those evidence-based practices are. And those 2 organizations are the National Professional Development Center, and they focus on the National Standards Project. It's a mouthful. And I will put links. This webinar is being recorded and it will get posted, and I can link the resources for where you can access what those evidence-based practices are. But they outline, I think, 27 different evidence-based practices that are effective for supporting students with autism. And then the National Autism Center also has identified different evidence-based practices, and they very much are integrated. There's overlap between the 2 organizations and the different bodies of research that they've done, highlighting and identifying what are those evidence-based practices that we know are effective for students with autism. And so when we have these program qualities or these quality indicators in place, it's going to increase our success of implementing evidence-based practices. And then in turn, we're going to see an increase in learner outcomes, which is our goal. We want our students to be successful. We want to have programs that support their success. So what we're going to do is we're going to really dive in and do kind of a balcony overview of what these domains are. And then again, in the end, when this gets posted, I'm going to share out different resources, a self-assessment that you can use that highlights each of these different areas that you can take a look at your own classroom, or if it's a program. And that's a really awesome thing about this, this assessment that we use is that it is multi-level. So it can be used at the classroom level, it can be used for multiple classrooms, it can be used at the school level, and it can be used at the program level. So it can be used as a program evaluation to identify what are the things that are occurring that are awesome, because we know every district is doing lots of things well, and we want to recognize what those things are. It also identifies where are the areas that, might be our weaknesses, and what can we do then to increase professional learning in those areas so that we can be better at implementing and making sure that we have all of the quality indicators in place. So that's what we do with our districts. We went in to put out a fire and to teach antecedent-based interventions and really support teachers when they're working with students who have very intensive behavioral needs. But in addition to that, we always want to make sure that we are being proactive and that we are putting long-term systems. We want to build capacity so that we can change practice and implement these quality indicators across the board. So when we take a look at those domains that have research supporting their effectiveness in programs, they include teaming, and that's interdisciplinary teaming. We'll take a look at that in a moment. It takes a look at the learning environment. Really, what are those components of the learning environment that need to be in place? It takes a look at assessment and IEP development. It takes a look at curriculum and instruction. It identifies communication, and that's at the student level and the staff level. Social competence. How are we building social supports for our students, and how are we teaching them to increase their social skills? Personal independence and competence. We know that our students are not going to be with us for life. And when they turn 22 or sometimes before that, they're entering the adult world. And we know that our adult service world is bleak to characterize it. And we know that autism has one of the highest rates of unemployment. Does anybody know what the unemployment rate of students with autism is? Throw it in the chat box. I'll give you a moment to respond. Yeah, 85% of individuals with autism are unemployed. And so making sure that our programs really focus on personal independence and personal competence is one way to hopefully change that 85%. And we can have a whole nother webinar talking about that. And we have in the past. Another quality indicator is functional behavior. And that's where we're going to dive into talking about what is that functional approach to behavior and what are the different things that we should have in place. We mentioned in the Jamboard, FBAs and BIPs. And so those are a very strong component of what we would need to see in place and systems for those processes to occur. The next area is positive learning climate. Sorry, my screens are a little off and I can't see. Positive learning climate. And the last one is family engagement. We know that we work with families and sometimes they're high stress situations and other times we have really good teaming structures. And we know that families, parents and guardians know their child best. And so how can we pull that information in and really build strong, cohesive teams? So now we're going to take a look at an overview of each of these. It's going to be a very balcony view, but we're going to break down what are some of the components when we look at each one of these individually that would be in place. We're going to begin with teaming. Does anybody have any questions before I dive in? Okay. So first, when we look at teaming, my slide to go. Sorry, I lost my cursor. All right. So when we take a look at teaming, I have the definition up there of what this domain really entails. So teaming really breaks down the process, that teaming process, and includes structures that include clearly defined roles, clearly defined communication systems, and collaborative meetings and problem solving time for staff to get together to be able to talk and plan. We want to make sure that team members are collecting and sharing data, and that data is used to make informed decisions. And then also linking that data to implementation of services that are outlined within the IEP. And so that all team members are collaborating on goals and implementing and cross-sharing of goals. The teaming domain really focuses on staff having access to professional learning that focuses on autism spectrum disorders and others that might be other needs for the learner. It's interesting because we're in a lot of schools, and there's oftentimes we find not that many people who have that autism expertise. And so there's a lack of resources out there that really focus on foundational autism. And I think this probably is most needed for paraprofessionals and new staff who might not have experience working with students with autism. And so one of the things that we have, and I'll share it at the end, is we're really focusing on developing professional learning modules that focus on foundation level, or what we would consider universal tier 1 professional learning related to all of these different areas. So when we get to the end of the PowerPoint, I'll show you a link to a website that has training that is aligned to each of these areas or is in the process of being developed, so that you can share more resources with your staff. So when we think about teaming, we want to think about team membership, and that's an interdisciplinary approach. So are we collaborating and scheduling meeting time so that all staff have time to effectively work together and collaborate and problem solve? So that means, do we have access to a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist, and all of the other related services that might be having access to a behavior specialist or a BCBA if we're working with students who have significant behavioral needs? It also means making sure that we have time set aside so that we can meet. Some of the schools that I've been in have amazing systems put in place for teaming. And I think that's something that really sets them apart, is they have, depending on when their school day starts, all staff have a mandatory 30-minute meeting prior to the beginning of the day. And so during those meetings, it's designated teaming time every day. They talk about changes in programming. If there's a new programming component that they're going to use for a student or for the classroom, they take time and they provide training on what that is. They might role play, they might have different case studies or examples of what this might look like. And although it might be 30 minutes, they really focus in on specific student needs and changes in student programming, which I have found in these districts that do this and implement this type of teaming structure. It's highly effective because everybody's on the same board. They're able to problem solve and be thought partners with each other in what their day is going to look like. And so it's almost like a nice morning meeting for staff where they're able to collaborate. So I highly recommend, if that's not something you do, try to figure out how you can align time so that all of your staff have that collaborative time. And I know with contract time, it gets a little hard to be able to figure that out, but I have seen it be very effective. And I'm happy to connect you to different districts that have these systems in place. And then another aspect of having that designated time is being able to have team training. And that might be the lead teacher in the room working there with their paraprofessionals to talk about what went well the day before and how might we change, or what can we do differently to better support our students' needs. So any questions about teaming? I've got a quick form that I wanted to share that I can make available in resources when this is shared back out. This is a collaborative meeting form that we developed. And what it does is it really captures, it structures up that teaming time so that you have an agenda. Agendas are highly, highly effective and very, very important, as are identifying different roles so that everybody knows what their expectation is of what they're doing and how they're contributing. It highlights what the agenda items are. And then for each agenda item, it has an area where you can really dive in and have your discussion, identify what the action items are. So it's an action plan that's built into the agenda as well. And so this is just another resource that you could use or modify to help structure up what that teaming time might look like. But teaming is a huge component, and hopefully identifying time when all team members are able to collaborate, or at least a core team of staff are able to collaborate. And I know there's planning time set aside for this, but oftentimes that planning time is not enough, nor does it sometimes happen because of other needs that are going on. So moving on to the learning environment, if there's no questions about teaming. Okay. So the next domain that we're going to cover and talk about is the learning environment. And the learning environment indicator really takes into consideration whether all aspects of the environment are safe for students. So that means, I have some examples up there. There's no electrical cords being strung across the classroom that somebody can trip on. Sharp outlets. I was in a school where in the hallway they were doing a lot of construction, and they had lots and lots of big cardboard boxes leaning up against one of the walls, which happened to be the area in which students are coming and going as they exit and enter the building, as well as navigate the building. And if somebody kind of touched one of those boxes incorrectly or wrongly, I'm sure they would have all fallen, and that could have done some damage. So things like that. You want to make sure that there's no identified environmental issues with the electrical outlets, cords, sharp objects, and you'd be surprised, some of them are laying around. And this is another important one, I think, as the world that we're living in right now, is making sure that we have strong sanitation procedures, and also really focusing on personal hygiene. And that can start as young as preschool and needs to continue to be taught all the way up through high school, because there's lots of different hygiene things that are very important as students grow and mature. And then making sure that there's continuous student monitoring. Another thing when we think about the learning environment is really taking a look at the classroom environment, or the space in which you're learning is going to your learning environment, making sure that it's well organized. Especially this time of year, oftentimes we see teachers hanging things from the ceilings, and sometimes that can become really overwhelming. So we want to minimize distractions and make sure that things are very organized. That also means having a space for different materials, and our materials organized. Is there a space for them? Are they put away in cabinets so that they're easily accessible by the people that are able to access them? And it even trickles down to when we're providing instruction for students. Say a system that a student might be using is a personal workspace, independent workspace. And so do we have the materials organized so that the students know where to get their materials, know where to put it when they're done? And so there's lots of different components about what makes an organized classroom. This domain also identifies the use of visual supports, which we know are an evidence-based practice for students with autism. And it's the visual schedules in a lot of the evidence-based practices, even though the research is on specific for students with autism, we know that they work all the time for all students. I have 3 typically developing children, and whenever I leave for a conference, which I'm doing next week, my kids make their own behavior charts. Mom, what am I working for while you're gone? And so it provides a little incentive for them to make sure that they're doing everything they need to do. So those strategies that we put in place for our students with autism are very effective for all of us. In fact, we all work off of reinforcement systems. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then really focusing on transitions. So I have some examples of what these might look like. So these are the different components, remember, the framework that we need to have in place. And then what I'm going to show you are some of the evidence-based practices. And I'm going to show a lot of pictures, a lot of different files. If you see one that you like, feel free to shoot me an email. I have the file somewhere on my computer and I'm happy to share it with you. So again, here's a environmental one, making sure that, I'm sorry, it went away really quick. Let me see if I can pull it back. Okay, chords, organization. And then this would be your classroom setup, making sure that you have well-defined areas of your classroom. And this is something that I think is really, really important to do at the beginning of the school year as you're setting up your classroom. And it's going to be based on your learners' needs. And I have grid paper that I share with a lot of the teachers that I've been supporting. And we sit down and we talk about all of the different students, what their needs are. If it's a student who's going to use an independent work system, is that going to be separate from their desk? Is it a student who needs one-on-one support or direct instruction? Or where is small group going to happen? And so we take a look at the students' IEPs and we identify the different structures or settings that a student might learn best in. And then we base our classroom environment around what those supports are going to be. So it's a lot of planning. Yeah, we can get a copy of it. This is all recorded and it's going to be posted up on the website. You'll get an email that outlines, that links you to the recorded webinar. And then I'll make sure that the PowerPoint is up there as well. And then I have some other resources within this that I'll be sharing also. So if you see something specific in one of these visuals that you want, just shoot me an email and I'll get that to you as well. So perfect. All right, moving on to some more examples. So these are examples of visual schedules. And we know there is so many different visual schedules. When we talk about the level of support, that's one thing that I think is really important. It's one thing that, interestingly, when I've been out in classrooms lately, I'm seeing more of a blanket approach that we have one type of visual schedule, for instance, a written schedule for all students. However, not every student may be at the written level, or we might have a board maker picture or an abstract icon when that might be really hard for a student to understand. And instead a photo might be a better fit for that student. Or a classroom that I was in last week, they were using the board maker icons and the student was paying no attention to them. And so we actually bumped it down to an object schedule. Are you familiar with what object schedules are? I often use like a pencil box. I'm sure I have one in here. I do. Just happens to be right on top here. Not fully created, but it would be like a pencil box and then you would put an item on it. So for instance, you might have a pencil and that might indicate desk work. And so you can have the student take the pencil, match it to a pencil at their desk, drop it in a little cup, and that would be their schedule. It's really important though that on the inside of it, you have all of the, it's almost like the cheat sheet for staff so that they know, hey, pencil means desk work. And so you really outline what each of those items are. And so this would probably be one of the most concrete levels because you're working with actual objects. The next level up would be a photo schedule. And that would be a photo of the environment or the item in which the student would be using. Next level up would be icon, like an abstract board maker icon. I use oh my goodness, pick, not symbol picks, but lesson picks, I think is the name of it. And it is like a a picture library, thousands, like tens of thousands of pictures, and it's like $30 a month. So it's a really, really cheap way to be able to get some of those icons, and you can import your own images in that. And so these are just different examples of the levels. The AM, PM, this is for a student who needs his morning and afternoon broke off into separate schedules, but it's a written schedule. He's able to write, and then when we get done with the activity, we just cross it off. And then the next ones here, the schedule on the left is more of a do folder 1, take a break, and then you need to move on to writing. The schedule on the, did I say right? I meant left before. On the right here, you would use the check schedule card that you can see is being held. You would give that check schedule card to the student. That would indicate that it's time to check a schedule. And when we're doing that, we don't use any verbals. Why do you think we don't use any verbals? Any skill that we want the student to do independently, we don't want to use a verbal prompt. Your first instruction, a verbal, is your instructional cue, and that's okay to do. But then any other time, we want to make sure that we're not using another verbal because we don't want our students to become verbally reliant on what we're saying. So here are a few more. Here's another one. This is a visual schedule for multiple students. And you can see, it's kind of blurry, but you can see in this, there are multiple different types of schedule. The red one in the middle is an object schedule. So that student knows when he takes this cup, it's snack time. So he would take that to the snack table and match it to a cup that is at the table and sit down. Then when he comes back, he would take the spoon. And so that is very similar to this approach, just using it on a full schedule on the wall, not portable. So some schedules like the Titus's schedule, that is a portable schedule that can be used. Sometimes I start off with the staff carrying it and then transition to the student carrying it, but there's lots of different types of schedules, but a schedule is one of the most effective strategies that we can put in place. And for some students, that might be a simple first then. Maybe a schedule where we have all these different activities in place is too much. So we want to focus with just a first then, and it might be first do your work, then you get your reinforcement. And so this could also be a behavioral strategy, which we'll see when we move on. Made a schedule for myself, Nikki's schedule. I have a morning meeting, then calendar break. How many of you guys are to-do list makers? That is another form of a schedule. Do you find great success when you make your to-do list and cross them off? Many of our students do also. And so we want to make sure that they have the ability to cross off when it's all done. The schedule on the right here would be a schedule that we created for a student that is a Google slide. And I think this, when we've hopped back and forth between remote learning, which I think many of us are living in that world right now, is it going to be a remote learning day or are we back in the physical classroom? These are all strategies that are really, really effective, and we found really great uses for technology. And some of those are strategies or tools that we may have not tried in the past, and we found them to be highly effective for some students. There's also some apps. If you are an iPad user, this is ChoiceWorks on the left. It's a fantastic visual schedule app. It has a timing component to it. You can move things to all done. Has a time, it has the timer, but it also has time associated with it. And then one of my other favorite ones is, oops, went too far. First Then Visual Scheduler HD. And so it allows lots of different formats. Like you see the list format here, you could just have the icon, you can import your own pictures. So it's a really valuable, you can do a first then with it. Lots of different options with that First Then visual scheduler. And I think it's under $10. So I recommend that one as well. It's very effective. And I know a lot of teachers that like it. And then for some kids who are low tech kids, because we know multiple students have preference for either a high tech or low tech supports. And so this schedule on the right, Mitchell's schedule, is just a check off schedule. That's all he's doing right now, just checking off the items when he gets them done. And then the schedule on the right is a cut and paste schedule. And so depending on how this kiddo comes in the morning, he might be required to cut his squares out and then match them and paste them. And then there's a next level up where they add in the word. So he'll paste the picture and then he'll have to write the word. And so they're very differentiated based on the individual student needs. Here are some other types of schedules. This would be a mini schedule that overviews the bathrooming process. We find these in the toilet stalls, in the bathroom, and it's very helpful. Any skill that we want to be taught or that we want the student to do independently, we want to make sure that we don't use any verbal prompts, because if we use a verbal, we're training an extra step, and we're sometimes opening it up for students to become prompt reliant. And so depending on what the skill is that you're using and how your learner needs, because it's always based on your learner's needs, you might want to think about using a visual to teach and using gestures or physical prompt instead of using a verbal, which is truly the hardest to not do, because you really have to focus on not talking, which is not easy to do. The schedule on the bottom is what I would consider to be a mini schedule, similar to the bathroom schedule. And what this allows, this was used by a phenomenal adapted PE teacher in our local community, and she has her students swim laps. And so anytime that they're swimming laps, they get from one end to the next, they take a paperclip off and they dump it into the little bin. Structures up his activity. He knows how many laps he has to do, and he first has to use the life belt, use his flippers, kickboard, and then he can hop in the water and do his laps. This is a calendar. This was a kiddo, and this time of year is really, really hard, especially now adding in our icky weather and COVID. We don't know if we're going to be in school or if we're going to be at home. And so when students need that level of support, sometimes a monthly calendar helps so that they can see what is a school day and what is not a school day. And so these are just some, random samples of visual schedules or mini schedules that are considered visual supports that are effective. We know that those are evidence-based practices, and they fit into that larger area of learning environment and how we can help provide support within the learning environment and changing the learning environment to increase student success. The next area that we're going to focus on is assessment and IEP development. So when we take a look at this area, it really captures whether data are collected and analyzed regularly. So that means we're doing ongoing progress monitoring and really collecting student data and using that student data to guide instruction. Another component of this is, are families involved? Are you sharing the assessment data and talking about what assessments to do with families and gathering their input in that process? Oftentimes we do our assessments at school, and oftentimes there are components that families complete. And it's really interesting sometimes to get some of that data back and really take a full picture of the students' needs across many different environments. So that also means that we have an assessment process in place, and we have an assessment process in place across all of the different multidisciplinary team members who are working to support the student. So making sure that our SLPs have assessments in place, making sure that our OTs have assessments in place, and then making sure that the data that we collect through those assessments really is linked and is used as a basis for developing those IEP goals for each of the students. And then another thing that we need to focus on is transition planning. And so we know once a student in Illinois turns how old, when do we need to begin transition planning? I earlier mentioned what the federal law was, but who knows what it is in Illinois? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. 14, beautiful. And so you'd be surprised. I've been in a lot of schools and we have some very limited transition planning going on that is written into the IEP. So we know that this is a quality indicator that when a student turns this age, we really need to switch focus on that transition plan. And sometimes that focus is, we need to find out if the student would be a diploma student or if they're graduating otherwise. And that also helps determine what are we going to be doing when we're transition planning. There's a process that I didn't include in here. Are any of you familiar with a MAPS or a PATH process? Do you know what those are? I love using them. They are person-centered processes that really focus on longitudinal planning. And so we use these oftentimes with, well, they're effective for any student, but for students who have, who might be more impacted, or even a student who's not as impacted. It's a very, very cohesive and proactive teaming process. So a PATH process, PATH stands for Planning Alternative Tomorrows with Hope, and MAPS is making action plans. And so they're two separate processes, but when I've supported teams to implement them, we kind of take questions, because there's lots of questions that really guide the planning process. So you start off with like the North Star, and you look, and we do this for students who might be in 4th grade all the way up to high school, but we look into the future. Where do you see the student in 15 years? And it's a very powerful process because we have the family involved. We have the family at the core of this planning process, and we invite the family to include any of their close support system, because we know when you have a student or a child with a disability, we need to make sure that we have support systems in place for those families. And then we involve the school team and any other outside members that the team feels would be beneficial to include in this meeting. And what we do is we take a look at who is the student now, where do we want them to be? And then we do some backward planning. So we have these goals that we've identified for 10 or 15 years out, and then we break it down to where are we now? And we show the gap between where we are now and where we want to be. And then we say, all right, well, what's a positive timeline? Do we want to plan for 1 year or just the end of the school year? And then we do backward planning, and we identify goals where we want to be. We take a look at the larger goals, and then from there we prioritize smaller goals. And then from the smaller goals, which might be 1 year out, we backward plan. So we say, here's where we want to be in 12 months. Let's take a look at where we are now. What might be 6 months out? What might be 3 months out? And then what might be some first steps? So really taking a focus on a student-centered approach. And the most beautiful thing comes out of these meetings. It is a true planning process. And I mentioned all of the different people that are on board and the resources and the experience that each person brings to the table. It's amazing. And the discussion, it's like, oh, you know what? We think he might want to get into woodworking. I know somebody who would love to teach him how to do this. And so it's really a very cohesive planning process. And one of the most meaningful outcomes is, because it's a joint planning process, teachers can often take the goals, because we write very specific measurable goals. They can take those goals and they can either attach it to the IEP, or oftentimes teachers will use that as their pre-planning meeting with families. And that really drives what their IEP goals are going to be for the upcoming year. And then smaller teams might meet to revise, to talk about action planning, and to move some of those plans forward. So that's a very individualized assessment process that might be paired with some other very specific assessments, but it's a great process. And so when we take a look at this assessment and IEP development, it includes ongoing progress monitoring, because we're going to want to make sure that we're collecting data on academics, on behavior, and we're going to use that data to inform and change our plans. If something's not working, we're going to use that data to help us understand what we can do differently and how can we better support the student. We're also going to make sure that those assessment assessments that we use are integrated throughout all of the support staff and directly linked to the IEP goals, and then have that heavy focus on transition planning. And that leads us directly into focusing on curriculum instruction. And when we talk about curriculum and instruction as a domain, this really monitors if the instruction is varied and, most importantly, matched to the individual student's needs and directly linked to what is outlined and specified within the student's IEPs. And so when I go in and I do this assessment, I do a very thorough review of the student's IEP. And then when I'm in the classroom, I'm looking for those supports that have been identified just to make sure that what we say we're doing is actually being implemented within that classroom setting or within the school. And as we take a look at the components of curriculum and instruction, we have classroom instruction, which really focuses on the curriculum that we're using, as well as the instructional approaches that we're using for students. And then it also talks about how are we planning for transitions. And that's not transition planning. That is, for some students, we have to be very direct and explain when transitions are going to happen. And we might do that by using their visual schedule. We might do that by providing warnings ahead of time, transition warnings, so that a student is aware of those transitions that might be coming up. So we just highlighted the assessment in IEP development and curriculum and instruction. And what I want to know, and you can just put your responses into the chat box. What are some of the different assessments that you are using that are specific to working with students with autism or other developmental disabilities? And then what are some of those evidence-based curriculums that you are using or familiar with? So go ahead and take a minute and put some of those different ideas into the chat box. And for one, I want to see what you're familiar with. And then I also want you to be able to share what you're using, what you like, so that other folks on our call today might be able to learn something new. So please go ahead and take a moment and add some examples to the chat. And there's lots out there. You're using equals math, but we struggle with this resource. You use unique. I'm talking about math. I don't think I have it up here. We have, you can see my boxes up there. That is Early Literacy Skill Builder. So that's a literacy program, but they also have Early Numeracy Skill Builder. And so that's another really effective, I think they're both through Attainment Company, and those are great tools, one for teaching literacy and then one for teaching math. TeachTown, love TeachTown. Lots of teachers that I've worked with use TeachTown. Lots of teachers use Unique and News to You. Teach. In what ways are you implementing Teach? So are you doing independent work systems? Do you have each student set up on a system where they have direct instruction and then they have their independent systems? And if you do, I might need to tap into you for some resources and pictures of your systems. We have a module that we're working on that I've been hesitating on releasing because I need a few more pictures breaking down that structured teaching approach, where we take a look at all of those different components that go into setting up those systems. And they're beautiful systems. Any other examples that you guys are using or familiar with? One of the resources that we're working on right now that will probably be available in the next 2 or 3 weeks is really identifying what are some of those evidence-based assessments that are really good assessment tools for our students on the spectrum. Are any of you familiar with like the ABLES or the VB maps? And those are 2 tools that assess different skill levels and identify where gaps are, and you focus on teaching the gaps. And the goal of those it goes up to about a 48-month age range. And the goal of those is to really get students to be academically ready to be with their peers by a 3rd grade age level. And then for students, ABLS, VB-MAP, PEAK is amazing, and PEAK has a curriculum associated with it. The ABLS and VB-MAP are just assessments, but there's goals that you can use to help with your programming. But for the ABLS and VB-MAP, the goal truly is to get them back to where they need to be by 3rd grade. So it really is focused on getting them to an academic spot. And then if they struggle with that, then there are more of the functional assessments, which Holly mentioned, the AFLs, as well as the essentials for living. So those would be, if they're struggling with the VB-MAPs or the ABLS, then we can switch to maybe more of a functional curriculum. And those are 2 really wonderful assessments that help identify those areas for students. And I have lots of examples of those. I've got lots of VB-MAPs, lots of ABLS, lots of AFLs, and lots of essential for living assessments. So if anybody wants to borrow one or take a look at it, or just meet with me and we can talk about what those different assessment processes look like, I'm very happy to share. Beautiful. Lots of different examples. I'm happy to hear that many of these are being utilized. And for those of you who might not be familiar with what some of those are, please reach out and I'm happy to share more resources. All right, moving on to communication. So communication is another domain, and this is really focusing on communication. And for me, I was talking with a colleague yesterday and she's like, well, what are those, core basic strategies that you would recommend when you go in? And one of the things that I always look for, in addition to functional behavior, because I always think behavior and communication are so interlinked, because if we're seeing behavior, we need to view behavior as communication and try to understand what the function of that behavior is. But when we talk about the communication domain, it really captures more than just those communication systems. It captures communication opportunities throughout the day that are embedded into instruction and across the entire educational setting. So how are the lunch ladies interacting with our students, and how are we creating opportunities from peer to peer? Sometimes we have classrooms that are fully self-contained and don't have access to typically developing peers. So how are we still teaching peer interactions? Because we can teach and set up systems for our students to learn how to communicate and socially navigate with each other. And when we talk about social skills, which is another area that we're going to talk about next, we really need to focus on each student having their individualized communication system. And that means working very strongly with your speech language pathologist to make sure that we have an evaluation component that breaks down what might be the best system for a student who might have limited verbal or communication systems. So I oftentimes will go into classrooms and I'll see iPads, because iPads have taken our world of education and allowed us to do so many things that we might not be able to do otherwise. For instance, a Dynavox or a Vantage Light cost anywhere from $2,000 to $17,000. But now we have iPads that we can load, LAMP, or we can add Proloquo or one of the other 1,500 different types of communication apps. However, what oftentimes I see is we don't necessarily match that system to the student's needs. So we need to make sure that our SLPs are working really closely with the student to identify what the best communication system is for that student. I will go into classrooms where there's lots and lots of behavior. And one of the first things I say, if we're having this high level of behavior, always view behavior as communication. And so what is the communication system that the student is using? And oftentimes they'll say, well, he uses this in speech. And I'll ask, well, does he use it outside of speech? not just his one-on-one time with the speech pathologist. And maybe we need to do a better job matching communication systems that are effective and going to be used for that individual student. And we have found there's been lots of research studies that have shown students actually have preference. So they may have preference to be a high-tech kid, and maybe technology is a great fit for them. But we also know that many students are low-tech kids, and maybe a PEC system might be the most effective. I was in a classroom last week, and it was a kiddo who has had some significant behavior since the beginning of the school system. And so I got out and I got to observe him for a little bit. And what I saw was anywhere he went, I mean, he had ownership of his iPad. He had a case on it. It had the little strap. Anytime he went into a new environment, he picked it up and he carried it, which is a beautiful thing. And oftentimes I don't see that. However, I did not see him once open up his app and use it to communicate. They are now trying to scale back a little bit and reintroduce a low tech, because I asked how long he been using the iPad. I think it was Proloquo that they were using. And they're like, well, he's been using it for 2 years, but he is not independent. He does not spontaneously use it. And we're seeing an increase in behavior. And so we're trying to problem solve and working with the speech pathologist to go back and find a means of communication that is going to be very effective for him, but is also individualized. And I think with the increase in the ability to purchase iPads at a lower cost and then spend $200 to $400 on an app, they're still pretty cost effective. However, they may not meet the needs of students. And I think that's something that I always prioritize, is making sure that we have communication systems that are very effective, because when these kids grow up and they're 16 and 250 pounds, and they don't have a formal communication system, that's when we start seeing more aggressive or more intense behaviors. So I always say focus on communication from the beginning, as young as possible. Let's try to start even with labels and labeling different cabinets to help promote some of the communication, so students can learn that if I use this or do this, it's going to get a response. And hopefully that would then decrease the behavior that the student's using, because they have a formal communication system. So oops, I hopped ahead. Let me go back really quick. In addition to that, I love it when we have our speech pathologists come into the classroom, even our social workers, and every opportunity for teachers to make sure that we have a very communication-rich environment. So that means we're going to ask open-ended questions. We're going to promote communication. We're going to direct students to their device, and we're going to have lots of back and forth, hopeful reciprocity with the student to really encourage use of their device and to promote that communication, because that is what conversation is all about, back and forth. So we want to set it up so that it is a very communication rich environment. And we want to make sure that we do that between students and staff, but we also want to provide and set it up for that so that there's peer-to-peer communication. We want to focus on that social aspect, but we first have to have good communication systems in place so that the students can be effective using their devices. We're going to have individual instruction, and oftentimes that's going to be using their communication device. So we need to set it up so that they know how to if it's a system that has lots of different pages, or a core language board where they have to go in and really navigate different pages and get deeper in to find the words that they're looking for. We're going to need to provide individualized instruction on how to teach those systems so that our students can be competent using their devices. And then responsiveness, that really focuses on when a student makes a communication attempt, we want to respond. We want to encourage that reciprocity. One of my favorite stories that was a big oops on my part is I was sitting with two colleagues. She has a son, the individuals who worked on our grant, she has a son with autism. And so we would at 3:30 every day, we live very close to, our houses are very close to campus. So we would pick up and we would move our work environment to Mindy's home. And we would be there because her son got home from school and needed to have a parent home. And so we would often, she had a beautiful back deck, and when it was nice out, we would be working on our back deck. Well, one day when Nick got home from school, and I am using his name, I have full permission to share stories about him. I've learned a lot from Nick, and I hope that I've provided Nick a lot of support over the years, but he came outside as we're diligently working. He's like, "It's a beautiful day." And we all kind of looked at each other like, what did he just say? He just made a social comment. And we were so fixated that it was the first time that he made a social comment. A little bit of background. This is a kiddo who did not start using spoken language until he was about 6 years old. And so that started primarily with the use of echolalia. He was a movie scripter, and he would use those movie scripts very functionally, but we neglected to respond when he was making a very he was socially commenting. And so we all kind of like, whoa, Nick, awesome, you're right, it is a beautiful day outside. So we really want to make sure that we are responsive to our students and that we help facilitate that reciprocity, because we want them to be able to socially navigate and use their communication with their peers or any situation. And one of the things I feel strongly about is that communication component and that social component, which we're going to talk about next, is a lifelong skill. And that is one of the skills that is truly going to set our students apart from being successful. If they can't maintain conversation, if they can't interact with others in a social way, that's something that we truly should focus on, or that's going to set our students apart. So communication and focusing on communication is a very important domain and identified as a quality indicator. Moving on to social competence. And social competence is just as important. And this can be a school-wide implementation as well as classroom level peer supports that are put in place and observed. If you have the ability to interact with typically developing peers, there are so many different types of programs now that it makes it very possible to do that. There's lunch buddies, there's bringing kids in to be book buddies, there is PE peer buddies, and those are just a few examples. But there's also teaching students, even if you're in a self-contained classroom, teaching social skills, teaching students how to interact with one another, teaching leisure skills, which really focuses on, the underlying part of that is that social reciprocity and back and forth and interacting with other people. So we really want to make sure that we're arranging opportunities so that students have the ability to not only talk with staff and adults, which sometimes they feel more comfortable doing, but we want to set it up so that they are successful interacting with same age peers. Other things that we want to focus on is we want, as adults in our classroom teaching, and we want to model those behaviors. And sometimes this is really hard because we're oftentimes working with students who are very, very difficult. And so there's one teacher that I work with and I love it. Above her door walking in, she has the smile factor. What happened yesterday happened yesterday. Today's a new day. We walk in with the smile on our face. And so we want to make sure that in our classroom, in our adult interactions, that we are modeling the skills that we want our students to be able to engage in. And then for many of our students, we're really going to need to focus on teaching those social skills. We're going to have to focus on social skills instruction. How are we a competent communicator, and what skills can we teach our students so that they can be successful interacting with their peers as well as adults? And then within social competence, there's this personal hygiene and relationships that really kind of pops up when students are in middle school and high school. And it was interesting. I was out at a classroom not too long ago, and we were talking to the middle school teacher, and we were talking about, all right, we know students in your classroom, they are approaching puberty, or some of them might be going through puberty. What are you doing right now to teach personal hygiene? And she's like, oh, we don't do that. That's what the high school does. And then we were talking to the high school teacher, and we said, it's one of our questions in our interview, how are you teaching personal hygiene in relationships? She's like, oh, that's not an issue. Our middle school teacher teaches it. Well, hello, nobody was teaching it. And we know that is such an integral part for so many different aspects. For one, we know that there is a high abuse rate, individuals are taken advantage of. So we need to really focus on that relationship component and teaching that for students, but also personal hygiene. That goes back to that social component. If a student is not grooming, if a student is not wearing deodorant or showering, that's something that's going to set them apart. So then what are the skills that we need to teach so that a student knows how to groom, brush their teeth, brush their hair, look in a mirror and make sure everything is the way that it needs to be. And this is also important for long-term interviewing success, job success, that they have the skills to be able to dress themselves and do their routine hygiene. And then I already addressed a little bit what that peer social networks looks like, making sure that we create opportunities for students to socialize amongst one another, in addition to the adults in the environment. And if you have the opportunity to include those typically developing peers, peer monitoring is a mentoring and monitoring. Those are an evidence-based practice. So we want to make sure that we can use our peers. Sometimes when we're teaching skills, it comes naturally from our peers, and they are the best models to be able to teach a skill. And so those are the different components that really make up that social competence, which is such an important component of our programming, which leads to another really important aspect of the environment that we want to focus on, and that is personal independence. One of my big things that I always talk about is we only have students for such a short amount of time, even though it might seem for a very long time. But what are we doing to teach students to be independent, and how are we teaching them to self-manage their own behavior? And sometimes that might start with the teacher setting up different systems so that students can be independent. But most often what we see in a classroom, not intentionally, we see paraprofessionals taking over and doing, assuming that motherly role, and sometimes doing more things for our students, which actually inhibits their personal independence. And so we want to make sure that we really focus on teaching prompting hierarchies for our staff, but we also want to make sure that we have the system set up so that we are teaching students to be independent, because when they're 22, they're not going to have us to provide that support anymore. One of my favorite stories is we taught a student, there was a student who had a staff member who supported him going to the restroom, and the male staff member was absent one day from summer camp. And so we all went to the bathroom and we sent this kiddo into the restroom on his own. And about 10 minutes later, we're like, okay, what is going on? Why is he not coming out? So we grabbed the principal, who was a male, and asked him to pop in. Well, the kiddo was standing in front of the urinal because nobody told him, was there to verbally prompt him through unbuttoning his pants. And so we also have to go back to thinking, oh my goodness, we created an extra step in that process. And if we would have not used the verbal to teach him to unbutton his pants, or maybe used a visual instead so that he could follow the steps, he would have been independent in that task. And so sometimes we do these things unintentionally and don't even plan for it. But what we need to do is any skill that we want that student to do independently, we want to make sure that we're using or thinking duct tape for ourselves, the adults in the environment, because it's so hard not to talk. But then we really want to focus on using some type of visual support, a task analysis or a mini schedule, so that the student can be successful and be more independent, learning those different skills. And here are some examples when I'm talking about providing instruction and teaching independence, because these are different ways that we can promote students to be independent. And that is, somebody had mentioned earlier, a teach system. And so this is a system, and all I have here are the matching systems. So you see on this bookshelf, I have Legos. I have a Lego of the 2 Legos that have icons that match. And I think these are all Lightning McQueen, because this is a student who liked Lightning McQueen. So he would have a mini schedule with a Lego block. He would take it over to the bookcase, match it, and then he would take the activity, complete the activity, and put it in an all done area. Then he would move on to whatever was next on his list, match it, do the activity, and put it in all done. So that's just one example of how we can teach a student to be independent going through multiple tasks. This is another one for a student that has higher academic skills. And so this is a folder task. She would have 3 folders. She would have a mini schedule, and it would say folder 1, folder 2, folder 3. And so when she saw folder 1, she would go over to her work area, grab folder 1. There's a little task analysis in here. As you can see, take out your worksheet, open your calculator, finish the next whatever number of problems, that until it says stop, put the worksheet back in the folder and put the folder in all done. So anything that we would have said verbally, for some of our students, this student was provided the same steps, but visually. And she could take in that information. It was concrete, it was there, it wasn't transient and gone, but this allowed her to follow certain steps and be very independent. It also showed her where to start, the amount of work that she needed to do, what to do and then what to do when she was done, and then what to do next. And so these are ways that we can structure up different activities and help promote independence. And then there's the teacher all done basket. And then this is just another example for a student who would have a matching system that you can see the mini schedule. It says 1, 2, and 3. They would match it to the big bucket, take it out, do the activity, and then put it in all done. So there's lots of different ways these structured teaching systems can be modified to promote independence. I'm going to fly through the next couple ones because we're getting close to time. So another big area that is highlighted is functional behavior. And when we talk about functional behavior, we really want to focus on those proactive or antecedent-based interventions within the learning environment that are consistently implemented by staff that hopefully, when put in place, would decrease problem behavior or maladaptive behavior. One of the things that somebody had identified in our Jamboard was functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention planning. And those are huge components of this area. So we want to make sure that we have people that are trained in your district to do FBAs, but really to understand behavior and then understand behavior with an autism lens. And the other aspects that we want to focus on are putting in place those antecedent-based interventions, the behavioral assessment, which is your FBA process, behavior management, which would then focus on that behavior intervention plan, or what are those strategies and systems that we're going to put in place. And then this is where we really need to have a heavy data focus, where we're collecting data on our students' behavior to find out if those interventions that we're putting in place are effective, or if we need to go back to the drawing board. So I have this is just an information slide. We really need to take a functional approach of behavior. When we take a look at functions, we know that there are 4 validated functions of behavior. I always say think SEAT. So you can see sensory, escape, attention, or tangible. The acronym for that is SEAT. And these are the functions of behavior. We're going to have a student either engage in a behavior to gain access to something, or engage in a behavior to avoid something. So that was just information for you. Another thing that we want to do when we're talking about that functional behavior is we want to focus on preference assessments and really identifying what are the preferences for the student, and then what of those items might be reinforcers. And a reinforcer is anything that would increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future. And we know that reinforcers change. If you think about your own reinforcers, we change our reinforcers frequently, but we also have a very strong reinforcer that we get each month or bi-monthly that reinforces the work that we do, and that is our paycheck. And so one of the things we really need to do is we need to identify what are our students' paychecks. And so I have this reinforcer survey as a Google form, I'm happy to share it. I think I have it where you can make a copy and then you can modify it so that it meets your needs. I'm happy to share that as well. And then when we talk about behavior systems, we want to make sure that we are using, I'm working for boards. And these are just a couple of examples. We need the student here needed to do 3 different activities. And what you see is we've embedded what his interest area is, which is Lightning McQueen. So he gets a little, he gets Mater and he gets Mater, and then I forget what the purple car is, and but he gets a car, and then after he's earned those 3 cars, then he earns his iPad time. Another example, this was used during remote learning where the student completes 4 different activities and then he earns 10 minutes on the phone. And we really want to make sure that we focus on reinforcement. Reinforcement can be delivered in lots of different ways, but if a behavior is occurring, it is continued to be reinforced. And so reinforcement really drives a lot of what we do. Here's some more supports. This is another reinforcement system. Here's another I'm working for board. These are some rules and some self-regulation activities, which is I will take 5 breaths. I think I talked about this in schedules, but it's also behavior support first then. This is a choice board. Offering choice is probably one of the most important things you can do. Oftentimes we talk about students who are needing control. And when we provide choice, that is an excellent way to give students control. Sometimes that might be a forced choice because we may not be able to provide everything that the student wants, but when we are providing choice, that allows the student to gain access to control. This is a warning board or a countdown strip. So 3, 2, 1, finished. Oftentimes we pair this with a time timer and then just another visual explaining when you have 1 minute, when the timer is up, it is all done. The last 2 activity areas. So positive learning climate. This really focuses on the staff interactions. We want to make sure that climate and culture of the building is very strong. So this really focuses on the staff and student interactions. Are they positive? Are staff truly engaging with the students, showing interest in the students, building relationships? Have staff paired themselves as reinforcers? And that might mean that we're taking time away from academics to really focus on building that relationship, which is going to truly impact that social emotional component and learning of the student. What are the staff behaviors and how can we make sure that the staff behaviors that are occurring within the environment are positive? And then within that positive learning climate, what is our focus on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I even think about this in the terms of different communication devices that students have access to. That's diversity. When we have students who use different devices, are we making sure that we have communication devices that are matched to each of the students' needs? And then the last area is family involvement. I always say we have oftentimes when we are working with students with autism, we have parents who are great advocates for the kids. And we want to make sure that we are truly including them in that teaming process. They know their student best. And we want to make sure that we can learn as much as we can from those, and they are truly a part of that teaming process, which surprisingly doesn't always happen. We want to make sure that we have communication systems in place that are effective for families. I know a lot of schools right now are using things like Dojo to communicate, which has worked well. Some families just use their phone and they text back and forth with families. And then another aspect of this family involvement is, are we making sure that the teachers and parents, when they're scheduling meetings, are very flexible and accommodating to the family's needs? I'm kind of going on speed now. Here are just a couple different examples. This is when families, and I know I threw this in here because I know many of us are going back to remote learning, but this is a sample survey that one of the teachers that I support with uses to gather information so that she can help provide the best instruction for her students. She does a weekly check-in, and then she does a parent input for learning. And then these are just some of the other questions that can be included. And I'm happy to share these surveys as well. This is a communication board that really focuses on what's happening during the day and is an awesome communication support. So when you get home, you can probe for more information. These are very similar, but these are more specific to certain students and what their day looked like. So lots of different ways that we can facilitate communication, but we want to make sure that we often have daily communication. If not, and if that's not needed, then we have weekly or bi-weekly communication, and it's not always focused on what's going wrong or if there's challenging behaviors, but it might be focused on the positives as well. All of these tools I'll make available to you. There's some self-assessments and different tools that outline these quality indicators that you are able to use as a self-review and help you identify what you have in place, and then what might be some areas that you want to improve upon. And as we wrap up, I really hope that you can identify 2 areas that you really want to focus on for improvement. I don't recommend doing any more than 2, because we know when we focus on too many things at once, sometimes it backfires and we're not as effective if we would just put our efforts into one area. And then as you think about what are those areas, what might be some support that you need to implement? And so I welcome you to either take yourself off the microphone. I can hang out for another 15 minutes. I know we've hit our time limit, so if you have to hop off, I fully understand. But I hope that you're walking away with at least a couple new ideas when you think of your programs and what are some of the structures that you can focus on for improvement. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so very much, Nikki. Again, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post those in the chat. Nikki has shared her contact information, and this was fantastic information that you shared, so thank you so much. Again, this session was recorded, and I put the link at the beginning of the chat for those who want to view this particular session again, or possibly another session that we've provided for the Autism Training and Technical Assistance webinars. So with that, we are a little over time, but thank you also very much for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, Nikki.
Send me a message. Thank you.
Have a great day.